Welcome to My Writer's Room. I'm BT Higgins. Welcome to Lesson 5.6. You know, you're writing lots of stories now. If you're going through with this class, you're writing a story with each lesson that we do, and hopefully having a lot of fun with that. Sometimes, though, it can be hard to find new ideas, and so I'm always on the lookout for places to recommend, buckets that you can pull ideas from. And so today's lesson is a whole nother bucket that we haven't talked about, where you can get your ideas from. In the last lesson, we talked about historical fiction. It's a fictional story that's set in a real time or place. It can have real characters in the sense of they lived in real life and then they're fictionalized in your story, or you can have fictional characters that just live in that time period. This is a really good bucket to pull ideas from. As you're learning about something in history class or just in some video or movie that you've learned and you find something that really sparks your interest. Maybe it's a time period, maybe, World War II, or maybe like when your parents were kids, there was something that interesting that happened, or maybe the ancient Greeks and Greek mythology, or Roman times, or Bible times, or any time. There's so many different eras and times, and every one of them is a little bit unique because each historical time has different places, different events, and different flavors of the story. Now, there's a lot of similarities, but there's a lot of ideas to be had. So what I want you to do, if you are willing, if you like this idea, is to find some real historical events and set your story inside of them. Now, an example of an author who does this and does this really well is Jenny L. Cote. She wrote The Ark, the Reed, and the Fire Cloud. This book, what she does is she combines talking animals, and those are her characters, and she kind of weaves them into real stories found in the Bible. This one here happens to be Noah's Ark, but she's got a whole series of them with different events. Historical events that she can weave her fantasy, her talking animal characters into the historical events, and it does two things. First, it has an interesting story where the characters you care about, which in this case is animals, are having adventures into history. And then the second thing it does is it teaches the reader about history and the real life events, because there's a clear distinction between the characters that are fictionalized and the ones that were real. Now, that's a good place to start. Another famous historical fiction series you can look at is the Little House on the Prairie books. There's a bunch of those written by Laura Ingalls Wilder. It's about a frontier family and their experience while they were settling the prairie during the American push west, a kind of frontier life historical fiction. And you can set your stories in a similar sort of situation if you like that kind of story. And so reading historical fiction like The Little House on the Prairie or any historical fiction will give you a flavor if you like that time period. And if it sparks your creative juices, then all you have to do is use the information you've learned from reading that historical fiction and maybe a little more research of your own to find new places and a little more details, and then you can just put your story into that time. Now, this can be a little tricky because you do have to know enough so that it doesn't sound like you're writing a modern story, but saying it's way back during the frontier days. You got to make it sound and feel like you're in the frontier days, and you got to know a little bit about things for that, but you don't have to know as much as you'd think to start. If you're just writing short stories, you just need to know a little basics, and sometimes reading a series of like The Little House on the Prairie will give you enough of a feel to where you can get started writing in that era, in that historical time period, and that can be a lot of fun. It's a bucket that's really big. If you're looking for ideas, you can find a million different historical events where something very significant happened, that you can just insert your own characters, or if you prefer, if you're inspired by a character in history, you just learn about them and write it from their perspective. Of course, for that one, you have to, be a little more researched because you're talking about the real George Washington. And so you got to make it sort of real to what he would say, what he actually did, what he actually thought. Unless, of course, now here's an idea, you could just have it be George Washington, but completely reinvented, into some other time period or, some other thing. So you can do all kinds of weird twisting and flipping of history where it sounds historical, but it's almost completely history. And so you can do that kind of stuff too. I'm sorry, I should have said it sounds like history, but it's completely fictional. I think I bumbled that one. So how do you go about finding one? First, just find a time period that you like. There's a lot of World War II stories that are interesting. Maybe ancient China sounds interesting. Maybe your parents' childhood. They tell you stories about something they did or a time and place that they lived in and how it was so much different. Maybe that sparks your interest. Maybe not. Maybe ancient Aztecs, the time of Shakespeare. I don't know, Ottoman Empire, Hebrew history, whatever you choose. It doesn't really matter. Just research it a little bit, as much as you can. Some things about, what do they wear? How do they speak? What was their life like? What was the big political structure or events that are going to be going on at that time? And then just imagine how your story would fit in. Would it be like, your characters are making the history happen? Or are they just alongside with the known characters who are making history happen? Or is all of that big battle happening and your story is off to the side, being affected by it? That could be really interesting and stuff too. So if you're wanting to do this kind of writing, you might need to think about keeping a notebook, because when you're learning about a certain period in history, there's going to be a lot of details and a lot of facts about how life was back then, and it's going to be hard to keep it all in your mind. Now, if you're just doing a short story, you probably can manage it. But if you wanted to start doing something longer, like one long book set in one historical period, or a whole bunch of short stories that are all set in that period, you might want to keep a notebook about the different characteristics of that time and that place and what clothes they wore, maybe pictures, and that will help organize all of the information about the world that your story is set in. Now, if you're liking to do this, if you're wanting to do this, there are software programs that are built just for this. They're called world building software programs. And usually they're designed for people who are making fantasy worlds, 100% fictional fantasy worlds, inventing, the land and the mountains and the rivers and the history and the different peoples and the different species and the different magic, and they're inventing all of it. Which that's not the case with historical fiction, unless you're doing a kind of an alternate history sort of thing. But they keep track of all their details in one of these software programs, and that helps them to remember everything. And so here are a couple of those software building programs that you can use if you want to start building your little time period and the details of your world, things that you might want to include or have happen, so that way you don't have to keep them in your head all the time. Sometimes it's nice to get them down and you can refer back to them, but you don't have to keep them in your head. Okay, here's software number one, World Anvil. Another one stop for writers, World Building Surveys, World Scribe, and Campfire. Now, I haven't used any of these because I don't write this historical fiction stuff, or the kind of fantasy fiction where I have to plot everything out, but it can be really helpful tools. And I think all of those have like a free level and then a paid level. So if you don't want to do something that intense, just get a notebook and start writing down the things that you noticed about the world. You know, the things I mentioned earlier can just be in a notebook is just as easily as they can be in a software. Okay, so that's the plan. That's the idea. I hope you'll find some ways to utilize that. You can make some really interesting stories by just putting them into different time periods and having an adventure way back then. Whether you're writing one long book or many short stories or poems or plays or videos, it doesn't matter. They can all be in the historical fiction genre.